Today we're going to talk about upgrading the shocks on a Suchiyu 16101 Pro remote control car. The shocks that come with the Suchiyu are friction shocks, and we want to upgrade them to aluminum oil-filled shocks to get less bounce and a much easier drive with our remote control car. Here's the difference. The car on the left has the original shocks with lots of bounce. A lot less bounce with the oil-filled shocks on the right. We want to remove all this bounce by taking these shocks off. To do that, there are a couple of screws that hold the shock in place. On the lower suspension arm, there's a Phillips screw that holds the lower end of the shock, and the upper end on the front shock is also held by a Phillips screw. On the back end, the rear shocks are held by a single screw on the lower suspension arm, and the higher suspension arm is held by a screw that also fastens on the wing at the back of the car. The oil-filled shocks that we're going to use to replace the friction shocks are replacements for Suchiyu 16101 and 16101 Pro remote control cars. These shocks typically come packaged in sets of 4 or 2 if you just change the shocks at the front or the rear. They'll also come with the shock pivot balls that have to be installed in the eyelets at the top and the bottom of each shock. It's always a good idea to keep the metal pivot balls in a metal or magnetic tray just so they don't get lost or fall off a table. Shocks are measured by the distance from the center of each eyelet at the top and the bottom. These original friction shocks were about 65 millimeters, as are the aluminum shocks that we're replacing them with. In some cases, you can go with a little bit longer shock to get a little more higher ground clearance on your car. In order to remove the friction shocks, we're going to take off the Phillips screw at the lower suspension arm holding the lower part of the shock on, and also the other screw at the top of the shock and the upper suspension arm. By removing both of these screws, we'll be able to easily slide out the existing shock. Before we can install the new aluminum shocks, we need to put the pivot balls in each of the eyelets at the top and the bottom of the shock. We can do this on the lower end of the shock by inserting the pivot ball and using a pair of needle nose pliers to snap it into place. On the upper end, you might have to use a special shock absorber tool, or in some cases you can get by with using a screwdriver that will force the pivot ball into the eyelet. Once we've inserted the pivot balls in the eyelet at the bottom and the top of the shock, we can begin to fit the shock into between the suspension arms and attach it with the Phillips screws. Once that's done, you'll really begin to notice the difference between the friction shock and the dampening effect that the oil-filled aluminum shock creates. We'll speed this up a bit while we're attaching the other front shock in the same manner. Look at the difference the aluminum shock, the oil-filled shocks made. The front, the dampening is really strong. The back still bounces like crazy. The rear shocks are removed the same way by taking out the screws at the lower end of the shock and the upper end of the shock, where it also holds the bracket for the wing. Once the old shocks are removed, replacing them with the new shocks is just the opposite. Inserting the shocks and inserting the Phillips screws to hold them in place between the suspension arms. Once all four shocks have been replaced, there's absolutely no comparison between the dampening effect of the oil-filled aluminum shocks compared to the friction shocks that originally came with the Suchiyu 16101 cars. Having these aluminum-filled shocks with the better dampening effect will give you a lot more control when driving this car, as well as better control going over jumps, etc. The last thing we need to do is to replace the body in the car, and we're ready to take this out for a test drive. We hope you found this video informative, and if you did, please like our channel, and we'll look forward to seeing you on our next video.